Now we come to the big one. Romans chapter 1. So it's about idolatry and those who have fallen from it. And now let's look at go on a little bit further and we'll get to the point. Therefore, verse 24, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, through degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Anything that gets in the way of the worship and service of the one God is idolatry. Okay? Keep that in mind now as we read the next verses. Verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions, reads the text. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Well, that's the big one, isn't it? That's the one that's regularly quoted when we're dealing with this question. Let's talk about it a little more specifically. The word that's translated nature, natural, is the Greek word physis. To be natural or unnatural is paraphysis, against nature. Okay? Unnatural means, in this context, unconventional. Paul, because he is Jewish originally, because he understands the same cultural of Judaism, he's dealing with questions of what is unconventional, unrelated to the culture, his understanding of what it means to be related men to women. Where God, notice, you might just put your finger there, we'll come back to that in a minute. Romans chapter 11, it describes God as acting against nature, paraphysis. When God does work beyond the natural, God works paraphysis, unconventionally, you might translate, as a matter of fact, in Romans 11:13 to 24. God acts contrary to nature. What does God do? Notice. God grafts Gentiles, says Paul, onto the tree of God's people, Jews. An unnatural thing to do. The Gentiles were not originally part of the choice of God, of course, but now God has broken off a piece of the olive branch and grafted it in. It's that famous image that Paul uses there in Romans chapter 11. God, of course, doesn't sin by doing this, no, just does it out of the ordinary. God's action, paraphysis, is out of the ordinary. It doesn't mean evil in God, of course, or lust or anything like that, period. All right. The natural is what is expected in the first century. Now, the word, as I said, natural is the word physis. The word creation is not that word. That word is ktisis in Greek. In Paul's world, as in the Jewish world, there was, of course, male dominance, as I've already said. Look at verse 126 again. For this God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchange physis intercourse for paraphysis intercourse, he says. And obviously, that means that men are dominant in the culture. There are certain roles defined for men in this culture, and this breaks paraphysis, that role. And not to be exchanged. These things are not to be exchanged. Women do not become like men. Men do not become like women. That's the nature of it. Women never take an active role in sex. That, by its very nature, is paraphysis. They gave themselves up to paraphysis roles with one another. That's impossible, says Paul in his culture. It's not thereby, it seems to me, the evil so-called of lesbian sex. It's about women who become active in sex rather than passive. It doesn't say lesbian sex. It says women becoming like men in sex. That won't do, says Paul. There is, notice, a loss of control and excess passion. Paul, of course, was a student of the Stoics at the time in the first century, and excess passion was ruled out for them. No. Passion is a dangerous thing, very dangerous. Paul describes that several times in there. You can have passion for the Christ, of course, but not for anything else. And then, Paul does not know, and here's an important point for me at least, Paul does not know by definition any homosexual Christians. faithful Christians. He doesn't know any. They don't exist. Certainly there were homosexuals at the time. Of course there were. But these were persons who were outside of the culture. They were persons who were not part of the culture that Paul knew. There could be nothing for Paul like a Christian committed homosexual. But of course, for me there is. I know committed Christian homosexuals. I can name the names of them. They are my friends. Paul knew none. Because by definition in the first century there couldn't be any. Because by its very nature, this activity was something else. It was wrong. But again, I would ask you, does that mean Paul's understanding of sexuality in the first century, is that somehow forever our definition of sexuality? For me, it's impossible. I now realize, after living a very long life, that sexuality is on a very large continuum, isn't it? There are raving heterosexuals like me, I suppose. And then there is a line that runs sexually. That people follow along that line in ways that I could hardly even imagine when I was younger. Hardly imagine. But I now know these people. I know persons like this. This is based, of course, then on a natural law theory. Judgments could not help but be made under a natural law theory. The sexual organs of men and women fit together. Therefore, by natural law, that's the only way it can be. That's the way they thought. Nature is heterosexual. But it turns out it's not heterosexual. Biologists tell us there are at least 450 species of animals that demonstrate homosexual behavior. 450 species. So it's not natural in the broadest sense of that word. It's a complex sexual world you and I live in. Monogamous heterosexual marriage, in my mind, this gets to the last thing I want to say, is not the model of Genesis chapter 1. Now, I know that's been used a lot. I know we use those in marriage services. I know that. I've done those things myself. I do not think Genesis 1 is about heterosexual marriage as a kind of norm. It's not. Because the word husband is not used in that text. It says man and woman. That's all it says. Man and woman. Now, we translated husband because we want it to be marriage. But it's not. The man and his woman, it says, over and over and over again. But that doesn't imply that that's the only way that human beings can relate one to the other. Not at all. Because we know from the very beginning, we have references, these texts themselves say this, that there are other persons who relate differently to one another, who have different understandings of what it means to be sexual beings. Let me repeat what I said at the beginning, and that is, the analogy of the change in perception of homosexual persons is exactly to me the analogy of Acts 15 and the acceptance of the Gentiles. The question for us is, what really is the most important thing in terms of our relationship to God in Jesus Christ? And I think when Peter spoke that word to that community in the first century, he spoke the word that I want to hear spoken now. It is not because you are circumcised, or it is not because you follow the kosher food laws, or because you worship in a certain place or in a certain way, or wear certain clothes, or say certain words, or speak a certain language. It's not because of any of that that you become part of the community. It is because of the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, whose grace extends to all the world. If it doesn't extend to all the world, then why bother with it at all? The issue is that one for me. Now, that to me that's a very quick run of the big texts. Now, I'm not suggesting that this, as I said at the beginning, it's not the only way you can hear these texts. Of course it's not. There are many persons who have heard these texts differently than I have heard them. They are good, faithful people. They're not bad people. But I think for me, as I've tried to understand in my own life in the church and prayer, that God is inclusive and wants all of us in God's world. Would it not be better to have all of us in the church than exclude some? Since we offer there, we claim the gift of the grace of the Lord Jesus.